Hello there, welcome back to class. If you weren't here last week, my name is Mr. Holly, and the lecture last week is click there. And this week, we're talking about shapes and lines. It's more interesting than it sounds, trust me. Okay, so let's start with the three basic shapes. What, you thought there were more? Well, there are, but in drawing you generally need three. You need a circle, a square, and a triangle. I'm hoping you know what those three look like. These three shapes are the three most basic things you probably need to know when you're drawing pretty much anything. Okay, so if you're thinking, but sir, where in the world could I use these three shapes? Guidelines. See, this is why you should have been at last week's tutorial, because then you would know stuff. Now, I told you last week about action lines, and then I said in passing that after you've drawn the action line, then you add various shapes, like the skeletal structure and such. But what I didn't say, which I'm going to say this week, because that's today's lesson, is that these are the shapes that you need to use in your guidelines. Now, each shape has its own personality, which will show various aspects of your character or your background or your building or your object, whatever you happen to be drawing. Let's start with the circle. Okay, now the circle's personality is usually attributed to one of innocence, naivety, friendliness, kindness, general niceness. You rarely have bad guys drawn with circles. Say the bad guy tricks the good guy into doing something. The good guy will usually be drawn with circles because it makes him seem naive and innocent, and they probably won't understand that the bad guy's evil until the bad guy has inevitably betrayed them. You see what I'm getting at? Let's move on to the square. Now, characters with squares in their design will seem more practical and strong, and not easily tricked or persuaded. However, these characters can also be stubborn, immovable. In regards to terms of good guys and bad guys, squares are sort of in the middle. Probably the most obvious way to use a square is give someone a super square chin, like the Crimson Chin, or whatever army general happens to be in your thing. And the armor general is always either sort of tough but fair good guy, or just corrupt evil bad guy. Rourke. The third basic shape is the triangle. The triangle's main point is that it is spiky. So characters with triangles in the designs, and triangles are probably the rarest shapes to find in a character, will usually be somewhat unpredictable, and perhaps not the nicest characters. On the flip side, the good characters of triangles are wacky, crazy people, like yours truly. Take a look at that snout. Now, you're maybe perhaps thinking, but what if I want my character to be naive, but also to be unpredictable? Well, my friends, this is where you start combining shapes. Yes, you heard me, you can use multiple different shapes in your character, though as a guideline I'd say try to stick to two, because more than that you might get a bit confused. Take a look at me here. My design uses mainly circles and triangles, and this is on purpose to show my character as being somewhat childlike and naive, but also weird and a little unpredictable. Well, say unpredictable. If there's ice cream, I think we can all predict what's going to happen. The important thing to remember when you're using shapes in a character or an object or building or whatever is you need to remember at least a couple of the characteristics that your shape will imply. So, like, triangles are usually used for villains, but clearly I am not a villain. So remember, your shapes don't always have to imply all of the characteristics that are applied to them. Now, this idea is often used in subversions. So most children are drawn mainly with circles because, of course, they are childlike and innocent. But then think of child villains like Darla or that girl from that movie with the blonde and the gap in her teeth. I can't remember her name. What was her name? Who are intended to look cute, to deceive you. So remember, the way your character looks will change how your audience thinks of them. So you don't have to subvert it or whatever, but it's good to keep in mind that you can. One thing I'll say before we move on, I've talked about using shapes in objects and backgrounds and whatever, and I haven't elaborated upon it, but the idea is essentially the same. If you want an object to look threatening, you use triangles. If you want it to look sturdy and strong, then you use squares. If you want it to look childlike, perhaps not as strong, but maybe a bit friendlier, then you use circles, like these chairs I have just drawn for you. But shapes are not the only things used in construction. What you also need are more lines, not just the action line. Take, for instance, a curved line. It's not threatening, it's really quite friendly. That's because it's round, like the circle. It implies similar characteristics. Whereas this spiky line here, ooh, that's dangerous, you don't want to go near that, because it's like a triangle. But then there's this straight line. It might be stubborn, it might be narrow-minded, but it'll always be doing whatever it's doing, because it's dependable, reliable. And those two words mean the same thing. Now what about thickness? Take, for instance, my whiskers. They are drawn with the thickest outlining pen I have, whereas these lines under my eyes use the thinnest one. And most of the rest of me is drawn using a pen the width of which is somewhere between those two. The reason for the width differences is because it depends which parts of drawing you want to stand out more. Obviously, the thickest pen stands out the most, but you don't want to use it too much because you don't want everything to stand out. And obviously, smaller pens, you can add more detail. But also, they make things stand out less. Before class finishes, I would just like to tell you of this week's assignment, which obviously you don't have to do, but if you do it, then send it to my Tumblr. I can't put a link in the video, so I'll put a link down in the doobly-doo. But what I want you to do is to draw a character specifically using at least one of these shapes, and then if you want to, try drawing the same character but using different shapes to construct them. Or perhaps maybe combine shapes, or combine, say, a circle with straight lines, or a triangle with curved lines. Just to experiment to see how your character looks when constructed differently. I have been your teacher, Cherry Holly, and so au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, and see you next week.